All right, so let's begin. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Coffee Talk webinar, Grounds for Change, Building Better Staffing Strategies in Fire Services. My name is Liz Kalaijian, and I'm a project manager with Capital Strategic Solutions, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. So we're really thrilled to have you guys join us for this important and timely conversation about the current staffing challenges facing the fire industry today. Fire departments across the country are facing increasing pressures when it comes to recruitment, retention, and workforce sustainability. These challenges don't just impact fire service personnel, they have a direct effect on public safety and community resilience. Today, we'll explore the root cause of these challenges, discuss innovative strategies, and hear firsthand insights from fire service leaders. We're honored to be joined by an esteemed panel of experts who bring a wealth of experience and knowledge to this conversation. So joining us today, our panelists include Fire Chief Steve Coleman from the town of Auburn, Massachusetts, Fire Chief Dan Sullivan from the city of Lynn, Massachusetts. We have Paul Normandin, former Fire Chief and Senior Project Manager at Capital Strategic Solutions, and Tom Impey, former Fire Captain, currently serves as a Program Coordinator at the Massachusetts Fire Academy and is also a Senior Project Manager here at Capital Strategic Solutions. And we also have our CEO of Capital Strategic Solutions, Nicole Figueredo, who's going to be helping facilitate the questions for the coffee talk, the duration of the coffee talk today. So together, they will provide valuable perspectives on how departments are navigating staffing shortages, addressing burnout, and implementing strategic workforce solutions. We want this to be very interactive as a discussion, so we encourage you to participate. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to use the chat function or use the hand raise function, and we'll address as many questions as we can get through during the discussion. As we dive into today's topic, let's start with a broad overview, and I'm going to start with Chief Coleman. Let's begin with you. Can you talk about the current state of staffing in the fire industry today?
Good morning. Thank you. First, I just want to thank Capital Strategic Solutions for having us this morning. Thank you, Nicole. This should be a great conversation. So, yeah, it's a great question. As fire chiefs, Paul and Dan will tell you that a large part of our job in the community is keeping people calm, right? We're the people that we're supposed to bring a sense of peace to what's going on, bring something under control. So you'll rarely hear fire chiefs use the word, crisis or panic or those kind of things. And I rarely use those words, but when we talk about staffing, I find myself more and more using the word crisis. And it's something that I've been watching come for close to the past decade. The last 8-10 years is really when I started paying attention to this subject. When I wrote a white paper called The Reduction of Call Firefighters in District 7. And since 2017, we've watched a steady decline of call firefighters, specifically to the point where there's many departments over the last 8 years that have no call firefighters anymore. They've seen 100% reduction. Most have seen a 50% reduction. At a minimum, people are seeing a 20% reduction. Same thing on the career side. 15 years ago, if I had one opening, I'd have 50 resumes for every one position. Now I could have 4 positions and I'm maybe looking at 6 resumes for 4 openings. So it's a very interesting topic. I believe that we are in crisis mode, and I think that there are some things that we can do to kind of right the ship. It's going to mean more work on our part than we probably ever have in the past. But I do think we're in crisis mode, and I think it's something that if fire chiefs do not start paying attention to, and not only paying attention to it, but actually reacting and doing something about it, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, if I can just play off of that a little bit. So, we're a civil service department for our firefighters as well as our fire alarm operators. So, I heard a statistic the other day that the testing, people who are applying for testing is down 50% in civil service. Our fire alarm operators, we have no Lynn residents that take the test. As much as we advertise and try to actively engage the community, no one is applying for the exam itself. So we're finding that we're pulling people from distant communities who eventually just want to go home. So, the retention part, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about later, but yeah, we're seeing it even in the civil service world as well.
So like you were just bringing up retention. What are the main reasons that individuals may be deterred from pursuing a career in the fire service?
Well, I've heard a few discussions on this, and I know we bring up mental health, the physical, demands of the job, the late night hours, which play into the next day's work schedule. But I question that. I wonder if the people that we're going after initially even know what the fire service is about. Certainly, once they get on, and they are exposed to what the demands are, that's a different story. So, I mean, I think there is a line between recruitment and retention. And so I think, we have to do a better job of once we get that, that individual, once we pique their interest, we really have to, use some creative strategies to keep them in our departments.
So what's the turnover like for new fire recruits that come in and they're maybe not super familiar with, they're new, they're not familiar with how it works. Is there a high turnover rate for those types of newly incoming firefighters?
Well, I would say in our department, not so much. We're not struggling, and that's partly because we have a good contract, a supportive community, supportive department. But we are going to be facing some challenges in the near future. So I don't know if it's too early to talk about this, but civil service is changing the way that they offer their test. So years ago, it used to be every 2 years. Now they're offering the test every year, and there's rumors that they're going to be having the test every 6 months. So what we're finding is, at least in many communities, is the firefighters don't have as much job loyalty as we did in the past. So they're shopping around. They're going to keep going until they find a better place, which is putting more and more demands on, the various communities to get better contracts, higher wages, better opportunities for professional development. And it's really straining a lot of communities just to keep up.
Yeah, and to Dan's point, I mean, and he's absolutely right. I mean, civil service over the last decade seen a 50% reduction, and just to put that into numbers, into context, you're talking 8,800 people in Massachusetts took the civil service exam 10 years ago, compared to 4,200 in this last exam. And I think civil service departments, I think are slightly different than departments that are non-civil service. And, Dan runs a great department over there in Lynn, and not a lot of people are looking to leave once they get on the department. But I think the challenge that civil service has is that a good majority, not all, but a good majority of the people that are taking a civil service exam have no experience in public safety, public government. So they really don't know what the job is until they get the job. And then they get there, and then they maybe realize or understand that, this just isn't for me. And they move on. There's a small percentage in the civil service world that will go to another department, but that's usually they get on a smaller department and they're trying to go to a bigger department. I think in non-civil service departments and, outside the city of Worcester here in District 7, they're the only fire-based civil service department. And most of the people that are applying to the Auburns and Southbridge, or even outside the district, the Westboro's, that are not civil service, typically we're getting people from either smaller departments looking to go to a bigger department, or they were called firefighters somewhere and they have some sense of what the job is. So Dan's right. Recruitment and retention, in my opinion, are two completely different things. And, I think we have to get more creative in our marketing. We have to be better at our advertising. And we'll talk about it a little bit in another question. It's going to come up. But I don't think we do a great job actually selling what this job really is. I think we sell a fantasy of what it is. And I think that hurts retention down the road. But in my opinion, the retention piece right now is more of a leadership issue than it has ever been in the history of the American Fire Service. People do not leave good jobs, they leave poor leaders. And we have to really do some internal looking at what our operation is, what the organization makeup is, who are the leaders, are they being effective, and are the leaders of our organizations running people out the door? Because if that's the issue, then that's a separate problem. Well, it's not a separate problem. It's a problem that needs to be addressed. But I think a decade ago, if you had asked me if leadership played a role in retention, I would have said yes. But a small percentage. I've completely done a 180 in terms of the percentage weight that I give leadership as a problem with the retention issue in today's fire service.
Liz, I got a historical perspective on this, if you got 1 second. So if you look at the history in regards to the fire service, 40 years ago when I joined, I was in a very small call department. You look up the makeup of the town and its citizens. There was industry, mill buildings. The good majority of those employees that worked during the day and into the evening shift hours, those employees would release those members to go to the fires in their local towns, and they were able to eat that. In the 80s, that kind of changed. Also in regards to the employers started to say, well, I'm losing manpower, labor from my business, and it's hurting my business. So they slowly stopped allowing their employees going out for these departments, fires and things like that. Some of these incidents were 10 minutes or a couple of hours. So they were losing, the manufacturers were losing those employees during that time. With some changes with the Firefighter 1 and 2 credentialing and certification in the 90s, that was the other way that pushed a lot of these call department members away. These guys were, other than working in manufacturing, they were electricians, they were salesmen. So they would, after hours in the evening, they would have to spend at that point several hours, a couple times a week, going through training and keeping up to industry standards and just basic firefighting knowledge. So they just basically left the service. My example is definitely the Southbridge regime. Back those days, we had 50 call firefighters and 50 auxiliary firefighters that put in their time and their effort and their certifications. And that supplemented 30 plus, or at that point, 30 plus full-time fire department. I am currently down to 7 call members, and they're not very active. Some of them work in full-time departments elsewhere in District 7. So that's kind of the historical, and I think that's statewide and nationwide. Those things have happened, and it's kind of eliminating call and volunteer fire departments.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, I think, in my opinion, there's 3 main points that if we're talking about call firefighters specifically, I think there's 3 main things that have been a game changer for call firefighters. When I got on the job as a call firefighter in 1989, we had about 70 members. And out of those 70 members, they were the good majority of them, 85%, were single income families. All of their spouses stayed home and watch the kids, and they were able to make it work on a single income, which allowed volunteerism, to flourish a little more. Whereas today, in order to make things work, at a minimum, some households need to be 2 incomes, maybe 3, maybe 4. So the amount of time available is problematic. Second is training. The training culture in the fire service has changed dramatically over the past 30 years, for the better, certainly. But there was a cultural shift, in terms of firefighter training, really nationwide as a result of the Worcester cold storage fire. The change happened right here in Massachusetts, where post cold storage fire, it changed the American fire service. It changed the view of how we train. And that included call firefighters. And when training became more regimented for people to get on, and it wasn't just on the job training one night a week, for a few hours. And this is proven in the white paper report from 2017, specifically in District 7. The number one reason that call firefighters left their department was the inability to have time to train, and they were not able to meet the training demands. So that's the number one reason that call firefighting is becoming harder and harder with the additional job requirements, that come on top of that. So it's a challenge for sure. And the third thing, as Paul had mentioned, is just society as a whole, right? The majority of our citizens don't work in town; they're commuting somewhere else. And I'll get into it a little more. But this is a generational issue. And one of the things that I think we make a mistake in the fire service is when we talk about generational issues, we always want to talk about the negative. We want to talk about, almost like the old guy in the movies with the newspaper chasing those kids off the lawn. That's not the way that we need to be looking at the generational issues. The reality is every generation is different. Starting from the greatest generation to today, every generation is different. Not good, not bad, quirky, right? They all have their thing. But as long as fire service leaders keep blaming the younger generation for what is going on, instead of embracing the qualities that they bring to the table and adapting, again, it's not going to get any better. So I certainly think that there are certainly 100% generational challenges. That's a proven fact. But it's how do we navigate that? And it's not always a negative. How do we look at the positives in terms of what we bring? But generational is an issue.
I'm glad you brought up generational. I knew it would come out at some point here. We all go to, quite a few conferences, more for the networking than anything. But as soon as we start talking about generational differences, I start scanning the room. Because we have the younger generation, the motivated people that are at these conferences, at these trainings, and we start bringing up the generational differences and they feel alienated. We talk about the me generation. We talk about what do they want and why do we have to, change everything for them? And, as leaders have to understand that, our departments are morphing. They're always morphing. We say that we don't want change. It's always changing. The money changes, the job requirements change, and now staffing is changing. So, if we're not progressive at allowing that change and allowing the younger generation to be a part of that, we're hurting our departments.
Yeah, that was my next question about generational shifts and work expectations, but you covered that. So this leads me, we kind of touched upon it, I think, when we started, but in your opinion, how did staffing shortages affect the morale and overall mental health of firefighters?
Well, I can say with us, our staffing, so we've gone anywhere from when I got hired, we had 255 people, and we've gone down as low as 160, and we're back up to about 180, right? So we've been pretty consistent with that number for maybe the past, 10, 15 years or so, but the population growth in the city is exploding. So, our people are doing more and more. We're carrying more people. Where the fires have stayed pretty consistent, which I guess is a good thing for morale, bad thing for the community. But with the increased demand or the physical demands, we're actually seeing a significant increase in orthopedic injuries. We have when I took over 2 years ago, we had 19 people out on some type of orthopedic. We've consistently had 1 or 2 of people out on some various types of cancers. So, you get the younger or the newer, I should say, not younger, the newer recruits, and they see that. they see, how people are always out, and they may not translate that well. They may think that the person is out because, of sick abuse or not being motivated, when in fact they're dealing with true injuries, true mental health, challenges. We can go on all day long about mental health and the demands and the sleep depravity, all that stuff. So that's a challenge for us. I think we've all done quite a bit with trying to support them from the mental health. We have done awareness classes. We've offered up specific resources, whether those resources are EAPs or institutions, clinicians, chaplains. We've done as much as we can to give them options to find out what works best for them. Again, we can go on all day long about the mental health and how we're trying to be supportive, but at the end of the day, it is a demanding job. We are going to see people not in the best light. We're going to see certainly the traumatic injuries, the hoarding situations, the disadvantaged, so it's a challenge.
Yeah,
So-
I think the staffing shortage issue, it's a two-parter, right? Because you can be short-staffed because, maybe the community isn't supporting you the way that they should financially, so you're short, regardless of whether or not you had a list of available firefighters to work. If you don't have the appropriate budget in order to be able to hire on the appropriate amount of staff, that's a different issue than having money and not able to fill those positions. And I think the way that morale and mental health is affected varies by which situation you're dealing with. Because I think if you have money and you're unable to find qualified candidates, I don't think it's as bad on the floor, because they at least know that the money's there, the community's supporting these positions. We just need to do the right thing to try to get the right people in the door, versus this attitude of, they think we're already too big. They think we have too many people on a shift. They're not giving us the money that we need. I think that has more of an effect on mental health and overall morale. The reality is that every department, I don't care whether you're the smallest volunteer fire department in the state or the city of Boston, over the last decade, everyone's call volume has increased. The dynamic has changed in all of these communities. And at a minimum, you're going to have seen at least a 25% reduction. Most departments, I think, on average, have seen close to a 50%, increase, 25% increase. Most have seen probably closer to a 50% increase. I know my department alone, just in the last decade, we've seen a 50% increase, and we're doing it with 2 more people on shift than we had 10 years ago. People are tired, right? They're tired. It's when you're working a 24-hour shift and you're running 22 calls a day in a 24-hour shift with essentially the same staffing that you had a decade ago. That's what affects morale. That is what is going to affect mental health. So again, as the chief, we have to make sure that we're doing our job in terms of advocating for the department, networking with the decision makers in our community to try to get them understand the true needs and challenges that we have, and try to get growth of an organization. And mental health and morale is a key part of that.
That leads me to my next question. So how could understaffing potentially impact, response times and or outcomes of incidents?
So, I think that when you're understaffed, how it starts to affect response times or incident outcomes, I think really depends on the makeup of your community and the volume of back-to-back or simultaneous responses that you have, right? Because if you have an engine company with 4 firefighters on it, but you're averaging a call every 2 hours, it's probably not going to have that much of an effect on the response time or an outcome. But if you're in an organization, like mine or Dan's, where, we could have 5 or 6 calls going on at the same time that came in within 7 minutes of each other, and you don't have enough resources to be able to deploy to all of those incidents simultaneously, or we're trying to clear up supervisors to at least have a presence for when mutual aid gets there. I think that's when outcomes start to be affected. And again, right, that's the fire chief's job, to advocate with their city or town managers or their elected officials, to look at your simultaneous call volume and say, listen, I know in our organization, 44% of our total call volume is considered simultaneous. It is every single day we have multiple calls going on at the same time that come in within 5 minutes of each other. So that's a statistic that elected leaders and managers need to know, because at the end of the day, your staffing is built on how many calls are we doing a year and how many people are we trying to do it with, and then determining whether or not that's effective in order to build an appropriate staffing plan. So I think it's based on your community, but that's definitely a statistic that you should be looking at and advocating your staffing.
Yeah, I mean, the whole country has seen it in the EMS realm, right? So, in Lynn, we're pretty fortunate that we're a small size. We're heavily populated, certainly, but we have 100,000 people in 9 square miles. So it's pretty close. We run, 6 engines and 3 ladders. Who cares? But our response times are historically very quick. Like 4 minutes is the average response time, which I know is not like a lot of the country. But we were seeing with our EMS responses up to a 40-minute response time. So you talk about mental health challenges. You have these firefighters that are sitting on scene with a patient that they cannot transport. They're trying to stabilize. And, it was putting our people in pretty precarious situations. I know a community nearby us ended up transporting a patient in the engine, which is a violation, right? So the chief was supportive of them in the moment, but deep down inside, we're all cringing saying, this is not what we're supposed to be doing. So we're all taking, as much action as we can to try to expand into EMS, which we'll talk about, later on, I think. But, we're trying to supplement, I shouldn't say supplement, but we're trying to take over, the medical services as well, which is putting increased demands on our departments as well.
And I could also say understaffing can also affect future staffing, right? And
Right.
what I mean by that, especially in small communities, is so in my community, we run 3 ambulances, real small community, 10,000 people. But if we're understaffed and we can't get the second and third ambulance out the door, we're losing revenue, which in turn the town says, well, we don't have the revenue to hire more staffing to get you where you need to be. And so it's almost like a vicious circle where if you're understaffed, you can't produce the revenue, because we all know everybody is looking at their budgets really tightly, right? We can't produce enough revenue to show that we can afford to hire more staff without having to go for a 2.5 override, which is in Massachusetts, everybody that wants to hire more staff is almost looking at 2.5 override to increase staffing, because the tax bases are getting squeezed so tight at this point. We're running out of development space, and so in some ways, communities are creating their own problems. Not that there's a way out of that, but they can't afford to hire the staff to make the revenue to hire more staff, right? It's a real problem for all of us.
So if I can, touch, if we're talking the EMS, versus the firefighting, we pair these two together, because it's emergency services, but they're two, distinct separate roles, right? So I think when we identify the people that we want in our organization, we also have to find out what they want, right? So many communities are hiring paramedics only, and they're finding that there are not enough paramedics to go around, and the paramedics are leaving, once they don't get that job satisfaction. there are a whole bunch of paramedics that do not want to be firefighters, and there are a whole bunch of firefighters that do not want to do EMS, and we blend the two together. So, creative collective bargaining, could address some of those issues. Like we had a few people that, in my opinion, never wanted to come off of the ambulance. They just absolutely loved doing their job, but the majority of the people that they were working with were in their ear day in and day out, and I think they bid out into positions that they're not as happy with, right? So, I mean, that's a leadership issue, right? That's something that we should have, stopped a long time ago and just said, listen, there are people that gravitate towards certain positions. Some like fire prevention, some like arson, some like maintenance, and we just have to find the right people for the right jobs.
Liz,
So if I can,
sorry.
Go ahead.
That's
Sorry.
okay. I'm just going to jump in for a quick second, Chief Coleman. The panelists you've all talked about some of the challenges that you've been facing. Do you see some opportunities ahead for better engagement with prospective recruits and with your existing, staff members? And what are some of those opportunities you might be able to share with some of the attendees here? Some ideas or thoughts, that's just kind of a question that, I have for y'all. If you see, coaching would be helpful, or if you saw an opportunity to do a larger community outreach, within your communities to your stakeholders, showing them the response time, showing them what you're up against. I mean, I think those are, some of the things that agencies have at tools that they could implement, but I wanted to get your feedback on what opportunities that you all saw as you're the experts in this field.
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to follow up on something that Dan said about, departments that are hiring paramedic onlys, that's something that I've been talking to my union about for over the last year. And, it's something that I think we're looking forward to going to the table and talking about, during collective bargaining. And this is something that I mentioned earlier in terms of, I don't think as organizations, we're doing a great job of advertising what the job really is. So, to Dan's point, these departments that are operating, fire and EMS systems, I recently saw a job posting of a department that operates fire and EMS, like all of us. EMS, is the large percentage of the call volume. Usually it's between 70 and 80%, depending on the community. But on this particular recruitment flyer, you wouldn't even know that they operated an ambulance. There wasn't one picture of an ambulance on the thing. There was, fire blowing out of a whole bunch of windows at, 6 or 7 structure fires. And some of those fires were 5 years ago. But there's no picture of the ambulance. There's no pictures of anybody in the schools reading books to kids, or fire prevention activities, or conducting an inspection, or the other 48 things that we're going to do this week other than fight a fire. So I think that our advertising is horrible. And I think that we're advertising the wrong aspects of the job. Yes, firefighting is a very important, and it's the cornerstone of what we do, but it's not all that we do. So if you have people who are interested in EMS only, or being a fire inspector, or some other role, we're not really showing that those opportunities exist within our organization. So I think we have to be talking a little more global about what the job really is. And the job is really about community engagement and community impact from a response perspective, but a response perspective that involves a whole lot of other things other than fires. And, so I think that, Bellingham, the town of Bellingham is the first one, I believe, in the state to split those roles out in a fire-based system and hired paramedics only. It's going very successful over there. And I can think of at least a half other departments that are looking to do that. And I think over the years, it's an untapped market. I I could probably right now, if I posted 4 jobs that were paramedic only, I could probably have those filled by the end of the day with extremely qualified street paramedics who have no desire to be a firefighter. And that is going to help our organization on both sides of the house. So I think engaging with labor more creatively, and again, I think looking at, to your point, Nicole, what can we do to engage with our existing employees? I think, and I'd like to circle back at it at some point to talk a little more about the generational issues, but there's a disconnect in usually what we can offer versus what the younger generations, whether it's millennials or Gen Z, what their strengths are. I don't believe that we're leveraging their strengths in today's organization. Some of that we're bound by budget. We're not typically as innovative as the private sector, but I think that there are ways that we can start to be more innovative to engage a group of people who have different interests than Gen Xers or other generations.
Yeah, we've been going after the newer employees, which is sometimes I don't want to say alienating, sometimes raising questions with the senior folk and why we're not approaching them. But we run a drone program, right? And the newer recruits are more savvy with tools like that. We're using AI a little bit more. There's we're changing software packages, so we're using them for their strengths, which is going to help that generation as they progress. The older generation, we try to use them for their expertise. We try to have them mentor the younger generation in exactly what the job is. So we're trying to hit it from both ends, I would say.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, if I have my budget presentation with finance tomorrow, and one of the things that I'm going to talk about quite a bit is technology, because my technology budget this year has grown by over 50% from what it was last year, because we're introducing far more technology than we've ever had before. I think we're up to 9 different, platforms, everything from records management to drones to, different med programs within the ambulances. Everything is heavily technology driven. But it's also getting finance to understand that there is a recruitment and retention issue to technology, right? And I think, my finance committee is very good. They talk about recruitment and retention. They don't want to see the kind of turnover that we have. There's a cost to that, and they understand that. But we have to explain, to the finance committee that, this technology budget, although it's grown 50%, this is what we need to do to recruit and retain today's generation. We have to be more tech savvy, and we have to introduce the things that they are interested in. There's a reason, when, statistically, millennials and Gen Z are on their phone for a minimum of 6 hours a day. That's a stat. Okay. So if we want to get them engaged within the department, well, let's put the programs that they're using in the device that they already have in their hand, that they're comfortable using, and that's how they live their daily lives, and they have since the day they were born. So again, I think it's those kind of innovative ways. And then just switching back to the paramedic only thing, one of the other things that we've done to try to move that in the right direction and entice a different group is, as police officers and firefighters in Massachusetts are in Group 4 pension, which means that we're able to retire at 55, at 32 years. But paramedics, EMTs and paramedics in the state are Group 2. But there is a law that went into effect in 2009 that allows local municipalities to put EMTs, municipal-based EMTs and paramedics, into Group 4 by a vote of either your local board of selectmen, your city council, whatever form of government you have. So that's something that I've recently done within the last year. Is I got our board of selectmen to approve EMTs and paramedics as Group 4 employees. So if we do move forward with that, you're going to be able to introduce paramedics into your department that have the same benefits in terms of retirement that every other employee has in the building. So they're not starting out on day one as a second-class citizen, to their firefighter counterparts in a different pension group. So it's those kind of things that we just have to be looking at to say, what can we do to keep moving the needle to try to attract people to this job?
I just want to jump in and say I see some familiar, friendly faces in the attendees. I see Chief Roy from Blackstone Fire. I see Chief Fisher from Merrimack Fire. I see Chief Dennehy from Westford Fire. So hi, everyone. Feel free, again, everyone, jump in, ask a question, use the chat function, raise your hand, even if it's just to share a comment. This is for everyone, so we can kind of, get familiar with what's going on and all kind of share our comments and questions. I wanted to go over the budget restraints and constraints and how that impacts the ability of fire departments to hire and retain staff. And I know that's what you had mentioned earlier, Tom. Does anyone want to add anything to that? And I think it has a lot to do with, we've worked with a lot of different fire departments, and it kind of goes back to the, firefighter, paramedic versus just a firefighter versus a paramedic, and how we hire those different roles. Does anyone want to add anything about grants and how other programs and trainings that can help impact the ability of hiring and retaining firefighters?
I mean, I can talk a little bit about, at least how it impacts our overtime. So, we have a minimum manning. We're budgeted for 35 people on shift. I'm sorry, we have a 35-person minimum manning, but we're only budgeted for 41 people per shift. So that only gives us six extras per shift, right? So if you take out all of their vacation and personal time and divide it equally, that's where that six number comes from. So as soon as we have a sick or injured, we're hiring overtime. So in the short term, the firefighters are loving it, right? So they're making a little bit of extra money. That's definitely a sales pitch. But in the long run, I think we already touched on it, is we're having an increased injury rate. We're having increased burnout. The cancer, we're consistently having some people with cancer. So, that's really a detriment to the department in the long run. We're trying to work with, the city government to, change that staffing model so that we can, increase, like the, just the perception of, the job instead of it being a negative. So, I guess.
Dan brings up a great point. If we were a private company trying to attract people to come work for us, we'd be out of business in about a week. Like, we have the worst marketing strategies. We say, hey, come work for us for little pay. You may get cancer. You may have, debilitating mental health problems down the road. Like the flyer, if we were to really point out some of the challenges that we face, right? People would look at it and go, why in God's name would I ever want, this job? So that's why I think we have to really kind of, put the spin on the marketing. But again, I think everything goes back to generational, the generational issue. And what I mean by that is, it's no big surprise, right? And this isn't a political statement, right? But it's no big surprise that when we look at what's going on in the world today, we're in trouble, right? Regardless of, where we sit on these issues, the federal budget is a mess. Here in the Commonwealth, our state budget is not much better. And we're feeling the most amount of pressure at the local level than we have since the recession in 2009. So from a budget perspective, things are not great. And municipalities today are relying more on the state and federal government than we have ever before, especially here in Massachusetts when Prop 2.5, came into effect. Prior to Prop 2.5, if a local municipality wanted to do something and they had to raise taxes 4% to do it, that's what they did. They didn't get a lot of money from the state, and the state didn't get a lot of money from the federal government. And when county government went away and 2.5 came into play, that changed things. And now the trickle down effect from the federal government to the state and the state to the municipalities, every municipality in the Commonwealth, we rely heavily on what our state funding formula is going to be. So when things get tight at the state level and that money dries up to the local municipality, it makes things tighter, and we're not able to be as innovative as we want to be. We're not able to staff maybe the way that we want to be. And that becomes problematic because, again, when you look at, and let's talk about millennials for a second, right? You have to remember at the time frame in which they grew up, right? And, a millennial today is anywhere from 29 to 44 years old, right? So, that 81 to 96 range. You got to remember when they grew up. And they grew up at a time where their parents and even the Gen Xers, right? Think about our parents. If our parents were miserable at their job, they just sucked it up and went to work the next day. They weren't leaving, right? That job meant stability. It meant food on the table. It meant the mortgage was paid, and that was their job. And they were gonna die there 36 years later, when they retired. And millennials, I think, saw the pressures of their parents, and really they defy that. I think when they grew up, and in some respects, credit to them, right? Gen Xers and boomers in the fire service, we have a horrible work-life balance. We have a horrible work. It doesn't even exist. And millennials, Gen Z, they favor their time off. They really look at that work-life balance as being important. And so I think that millennials, more so than Gen Z, millennials saw their parents struggle. They saw the pressures that they had. And I think they made a choice to say, that's not how I'm going to live. And so they value things that are different from things that we value. And again, it's easy to say that they contract shop and they jump around. Okay, they do, because they don't have the mindset of, I'm not going to live like my parents. If I don't like it here, I'm going to leave. If I have an opportunity to make more money somewhere and maybe have a little more stability, I'm going to leave. Even if that means leaving the public sector and going to the private sector. So I think, when it comes to the budget, public government is never going to be as innovative. We're never going to be as competitive as the private sector. Quite frankly, the public would never allow it, right? Because there's a certain segment of the public that already feels we get too much and we're already too big and we're already overpaid, right? And as much as there's a cry from the public that says you need to run like a business, they would never allow us to run like a business because we'll never be funded in the way that a business is funded in order to be able to thrive or operate. So I think that's the fundamental challenge when you're trying to recruit Gen Z or millennials who are tech driven. They have a different view on work-life balance. They have a different view of stability. And they're coming into an organization that isn't well funded. And especially in times like now, the job itself may be in jeopardy. Think about every 15 to 18-year-old kid right now, today, whose parent is a federal worker. Again, regardless of what you feel on either side of that, why would a kid between 15 and 18 want to work for the government when right now we're just showing that not only it's not a stable job, and it's really not the most loved job, government at any level. And that's another point is, again, 30 years ago when I got on the job as a young kid, I didn't know much about the federal government. I didn't even know much about the state government because those things were a little more clearly defined. I think Gen Z and Gen X, Gen Z and millennials, largely they have a general distrust of the government. And I think for the first time, local government is now just kind of thrown in that mix of government. Doesn't matter whether it's local, state, or federal. They don't want to work for the government. And that's also part of the problem, because I think it's largely sometimes seen as unstable and not always properly funded. That's my long rant on that.
Thanks, Chief. I'm going to just jump in. I think we have a question from the chat from Becky Pine. I'm just going to read it to everyone. With the bulk of calls happening between 6 a.m. and midnight, and with small town budgets under incredible pressure, has anyone had success with having some of the department on different shift schedules than having everyone on 24 shifts in order to keep a small number of people on duty overnight and more people during the day? Anyone want to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, I know in the town of Auburn, before we went, 24, we were 24 hours a day, 5 days a week. And the strategy back then was, I think we had 10 full-timers at that time. And we concentrated with a larger shift during the day, 5 or 6. And then on the midnight and the overnight, it dropped to 2. But I know a lot of, departments in the district that kind of do that, and as much as we would love to roll out with a full engine company, again, right, you have to look at the resources that the community has. What can we realistically achieve? What is your call volume? You have to be very data driven. How many calls? When are the calls happening? Where are the calls happening? And you have to utilize the staff that you have to make the biggest impact that you can. And data is a good way to do that. It's great to wake up in the morning and say, we want to be 24/7, 365. But if you don't have the resources to do that, you really have to look at your data to figure out what the best staffing plan and model is. But there are many departments within the district that are kind of doing something similar to what she suggested in terms of a lighter staff, at different hours to make sure that the coverage is there.
I think just on another note in regards to that, Fire District 7 populations in each of the towns and small cities go from 2,000 per town to up to over 20,000. Some of our smaller communities, the one that I actually originally grew up in, East Brookfield, they have a different philosophy because of those mills shutting down and the employees not letting EMTs or firefighters go on calls during the day. They actually did a reverse. They have daytime staff, and then at night they do rely on their call department. So that is a little bit different. It's a flip that what Chief Coleman was talking about. So I believe municipalities and fire chiefs have thought outside the box to get the best bang for their taxpayer money. And also, the coverage is sufficient for those areas. So just another tidbit of information.
And I would also say in Plainville, we actually did impact shifts. And so we were looking to put more staffing on. The town allowed us to put people on from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., one Monday through Thursday, one Tuesday through Friday. And that was able to supplement our staff until we were able to create enough revenue and prove that the need was there. And then when the budget got better, we were able to put those people on full time, right? So impact shifts can definitely help alleviate some of the stress on the people that we currently have and give somebody an opportunity to get in the fire service, right? So impact shifts can definitely be effective if used correctly.
We also have another question in chat from Richard. How can department leadership change the mindset of new firefighters and convince them that this is the best job?
Well, I think if you pull in everything that we've been talking about, right? So, I think we who've been around a while know the negative side of it, but when the new firefighters come in, they're looking at this like it is the best job in the world, and we have to continue that thought process, right? So we have to, show them the opportunities that are out there, right? Give them opportunities for professional development, for career growth, all of that. So that whether that gets them into the drone programs, the hazmat technician programs, the tech rescue programs that are out there, fire prevention activities, community engagement. There are so many opportunities for people. We just have to find out what interests them. And that's just knowing your people, right? If we're staying in the office all day and your company offices are just allowed to sit and study or not engage with them, then I think that hurts departments across the country.
Right, but Dan, how do we do that? So let's be honest. All of us have been in the fire service for more than 20 years. Over the last 20 years, all the professional development that we've done, how many of the same faces have we seen in the fire instructors, the fire officers, the CFO programs, right? We're all in these classes together, and it comes back to 90% of the work gets done by 10% of the people. Well, 10% of our people want to professionally develop. What we need to do is grow that so we get more of our people to want to professionally develop rather than just 10% of them to prepare people for the future, right? And it's been that way as long as I've been in the fire service. I've seen the same people in the same classes. Occasionally new people pop in, but we need to get everybody motivated and stress to them how important professional development is, especially the way the fire service continually changes, right? You have to stay up on things and not be stuck back 20 years ago, right? So that's certainly a challenge.
So we've been trying to identify. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, we just have another question. I just want to be mindful of time and make sure we address this. This is from Chief Roy in Blackstone, who said small departments like the Blackstone Fire Department have a hard time keeping up with the salaries of larger towns and cities. I feel this prevents qualified applicants from applying to us. What can small towns like Blackstone, Mendon, and Millville do to compete with larger towns, cities regarding salaries to attract potential new staff? The most recent contract has tried to attract staffing, but I feel that we will continue to fall behind.
So, I honestly think Chief Craven and Chief Roy's question is tied together. I really think it's the same thing, and I mentioned it already. I think it comes down to leadership. I agree with Chief Craven. I'm just reading his comment here, and it says, when a person was born or what generation they belong to does not determine the entirety of their worth. I agree 100%. And that was the point of my comment, is that we, as leaders, even as, senior leaders in the fire service, if they hold the rank of firefighter, their generation doesn't matter. I really feel I have a great group of people that work in our organization. And we have built a culture and a mindset that really kind of breaks down the barriers of the generation. I can honestly say that we do not have a whole lot of generational talk in my building. And right now I employ more 21 to 23-year-olds than we have in the 18 years that I've been in Auburn, right? I have 21-year-olds and I have people who are set to retire in the next couple of years, and they could be working on the ambulance together tomorrow. And they're like best friends, right? But that comes with a culture, and it starts with leadership. To kind of just circle back to Chief Craven's question, when it says, how can department leadership change the mindset of new firefighters and convince them that this is the best job? Well, the reality is they don't. And I've always fundamentally had a problem with, when they say this is the best job in the world. It's not for everybody. Everybody has a different take on it. This is a great job. But unless you have good people and good leadership, you can make the best job or the greatest job in the world the most miserable experience for somebody. So this is a leadership problem. And although we're talking about hiring and we're talking about recruiting and retaining people, I have said since the day I became a chief officer, I would rather run short than bring the wrong people into the organization. So it starts with smart hiring. And to Tom's point, I don't really face that problem. I have a group of go-getters where I have to say no sometimes because I don't have the money to do all of the things that they want to do. But that's because the people we brought into the organization were go-getters. They want to be the best that they can be, but they have to be inspired to do that. And they have to be treated well by their bosses. They have to be treated well by their coworkers. And, I've said this before too. Money is important. Money is what makes the world go round. Money is what put foods on our table. But to Chief Roy's point, money isn't everything. And in my experience, people are willing to make a little less money. You have to be competitive. Small towns have to be competitive, but you may not have to be equal. But if you're not equal, you have to be bringing some other value to the table. And that value is, how do we treat our employees? Do we have solid leadership? Are we doing the best we can with what we have? Do we have an encouraging environment? Are we trying to stay competitive? I think people are willing to make a little less, providing they have good working conditions. But when you don't have good working conditions, and you don't have good pay, and you have poor leaders, it's a recipe for disaster. But I don't think you're never going to convince somebody with words that this is the best job. You have to show them in action that this is a great job with great leaders and great people.
Thank you, Chief. I just want to say thank you, everyone. We're wrapping up right now. And thanks for the great questions and sharing your experiences. Especially thank you to our panelists for sharing their expertise. And if anyone has more questions for our chiefs, for anyone on our panel, please feel free to email us at info@capitalstrategicsolutions.com. You know us, you can connect with us. I did see some really familiar, friendly faces in there today. Thanks for everyone who joined. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you at a future coffee talk. So thank you. Don't hesitate to reach out to us, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming on.